Men and women of various backgrounds and ages stood united in their anger and resentment, wanting a closer look at the man who had terrorized the country with his heinous crime. Many were likely surprised by what they saw, as Timothy Evans did not look like a killer. Just looking at him evoked a bitter feeling of pity. He was a weak man with a scared, foolish face and a slight limp due to an old ankle injury. Is this the killer? Did we really stand in the cold for hours to see this tiny creature? One person asked in disappointment as Timothy, surrounded by police, made his way through the crowd, looking terrified at the hostile stares. This was the final session of Timothy's trial, where he was accused of killing his wife and infant daughter. The jury took only 40 minutes to return with a guilty verdict. The word guilty had a heavy impact on Timothy, who collapsed, crying out in anguish, "I'm innocent." His desperate pleas were met only with looks of satisfaction and smirks from most of the spectators. The judge then pronounced the final sentence, death by hanging. Timothy was taken to his death on the morning of March 9, 1950. Terrified, he couldn't stand. So the guards carried him to the execution chamber, where the famous executioner Albert Pierrepoint quickly and expertly placed the noose around Timothy's neck, ignoring his desperate cries of innocent. "I swear I'm innocent." Those were words the old executioner had heard from many men and women whose necks he had encircled with his terrible rope, and they meant nothing to him anymore. Within minutes, Timothy was hanged and quickly buried in a small, unmarked grave in the desolate backyard of Pentonville Prison. His miserable life finally ended, but his strange story did not, and it would continue to shake Britain to its core. Now that we know his end, let's return to the beginning to learn the origin of the story. Timothy John Evans was born in a small town in South Wales, UK, in 1924. Misfortune was his companion even before he was born, as his father abandoned the family a month before his birth. Timothy grew up fatherless under his mother's care, tasting poverty and deprivation from a young age. His troubles didn't stop at poverty. He was also physically weak and intellectually slow, struggling with education and leaving school barely able to write his name. He also suffered a crippling injury to his right foot in childhood, leaving him with a limp for the rest of his life. His mother later remarried, and the family moved to London in 1935, where Timothy worked various menial jobs but couldn't keep any due to his foot problems. Known among his peers for his lies and exaggerated stories, Timothy likely used these as a way to compensate for the many things he lacked, or to make a better impression on others. In 1947, a friend set him up on a date with a young woman named Beryl Thorley, and their relationship quickly led to marriage. Initially, they lived with Timothy's mother, but a few months later, when Beryl became pregnant, they decided to find their own place. They rented the second floor of a rundown old house at 10 Rillington Place, in a poor and working-class area of London. The house had 3 floors, with the first floor occupied by a tenant named John Christie and his wife Ethel. All the floors were small and lacked bathrooms, so the shared toilet was in the backyard next to the laundry room. John Christie, the neighbor, was a man in his late 40s, working as a clerk and known for his large, shiny bald head and his soft, almost whispering voice, a result of an old throat injury. Unfortunately, Timothy and Beryl's life in their new home was far from happy, marked by frequent quarrels. Even the birth of their beautiful baby girl, Geraldine, didn't calm things down. Most of their problems stemmed from their dire financial situation, with Timothy accusing Beryl of being wasteful and mismanaging the household, while Beryl accused him of spending most of his wages on alcohol. Sadly, both were right. Beryl was not a thrifty wife, and Timothy was not careful with his money. Gradually, their arguments turned violent, and their neighbors got used to the sounds of their shouting. Matters worsened when Beryl became pregnant again, an unplanned pregnancy, as they couldn't afford to raise another child. Beryl suggested an abortion, and Timothy reluctantly agreed. We mentioned earlier that Timothy's bad luck accompanied him throughout his life, and it was perhaps this misfortune that led him to live above the apartment of John Christie, an elderly, bald man with a soft voice. Christie's relationship with his neighbors was very good. Everyone saw him as a kind man and a respectable husband. However, there was a dark side to Mr. Christie's life that the neighbors knew nothing about. John Christie was born in 1899 in a small town in Yorkshire, England. He was the sixth of 7 children to a harsh, unfeeling father and an overly protective mother. As a child, Christie was quiet and reclusive but notably intelligent, excelling particularly in algebra, which earned him a school scholarship. However, he left school at 15, and 2 years later, in 1916, he joined the army during the height of World War I. He was sent to the front lines in France, where he suffered a chemical attack by the Germans and was returned to a hospital in England. According to Christie, this injury affected his vocal cords, making his voice soft like a whisper, although some who knew him believed he deliberately changed his voice to attract attention and sympathy. John Christie's main problem throughout his life was not his voice, but his impotence. His first sexual experience with a woman was disastrous. He was mocked for his inability to perform, leading people to call him a eunuch. Such a label would be difficult and harsh for any man, and it left a devastating impact on Christie's personality, driving him to frequent brothels from a young age. Interestingly, he didn't suffer from a physical defect. His problem was psychological. While he was unable to have normal relations with respectable women, he had no issues with prostitutes. Despite his impotence, Christie married a woman named Ethel Simpson at 21, but couldn't consummate the marriage on their wedding night. He ran from her arms to a nearby brothel to be with a prostitute. Despite his sexual problems and periods of separation, his unfruitful marriage to Ethel endured for many years. Another dark aspect of John Christie's life was his repeated imprisonments for minor crimes such as theft, forgery, and assaulting a prostitute. Ironically, he also worked for a time as an informant and private detective. The most dangerous part of Christie's life story is his realization at some point that he could have sex with any woman, even if she wasn't a prostitute, as long as she was unconscious or dead. This realization unleashed the monster within him, and he went on a frenzied killing spree. It's unclear who his first victim was, as there is much debate about the number of his victims. Official police records state that the first victim was a 21-year-old Austrian immigrant named Ruth First, a factory worker who occasionally prostituted herself for extra money. Christie met her in a bar in 1943 and took advantage of his wife's absence to bring Ruth to his apartment and strangle her in bed. It seems he couldn't have sex with her while she was alive, so he killed her and found no difficulty in having sex with her dead body. Ruth was buried in the backyard garden. The second victim was Muriel Eady, a co-worker of Christie's. He devised an elaborate plan to lure her, exploiting her complaints of recurrent chest pains by convincing her he could treat her with a special gas he prepared at home. She believed him and accompanied him to his house while his wife was away. Christie made her sit on a comfortable couch, then placed a rubber tube in her mouth, making her inhale his special gas. The tube was actually connected to the household gas supply. Coal gas was used for cooking and heating in England at the time. Muriel lost consciousness, and Christie immediately began raping her. When he was done, he strangled her with a rope and buried her next to Ruth in the garden. In 1948, a young couple moved into the second floor of a house where John Christie lived on the first floor. This couple was none other than Timothy Evans and his wife Beryl. Quickly, the new neighbors formed a close relationship with Mr. Christie and his esteemed wife. To the Evanses, Mr. Christie appeared to be a respectable and trustworthy neighbor, and his wife a kind and helpful woman. Little did the unfortunate couple know that this seemingly respectable neighbor was actually a notorious serial killer, and that there were already 2 human corpses buried in the garden of the house. From Mr. Christie's perspective, his relationship with the couple was that of a predator and his prey. A skilled predator must camouflage himself well while waiting for the right moment to strike, and Christie knew he wouldn't have to wait long. His prey was easy, after all. When the predator is a man like John Christie, with an IQ of 128, and the prey is Timothy Evans, an uneducated young man with an IQ of no more than 70, It is a decidedly uneven match between a genius and a mentally impaired individual. For Christie, the noise of the daily quarrels and fights between the couple was music to his ears. Every scream brought him closer to his goal. He enjoyed playing the role of the kind neighbor who intervened to reconcile disputes, and he took on the part of the sincere advisor, all the while eyeing the young and beautiful wife whom he had lusted after since he first saw her. The golden opportunity came a few months later when Timothy complained to him about his wife's unexpected pregnancy and their desire to have an abortion. Christie's cunning mind immediately began to devise a meticulous plan and trap. At that time, abortion was illegal in Britain, and undergoing an unlawful abortion was very costly for a couple living in extreme poverty. This is where John Christie stepped in, claiming to be skilled in performing abortions and offering to abort Beryl's pregnancy for free. That fateful morning was the last one Beryl ever saw, as the abortion ended with her being strangled to death by the seemingly kind neighbor who violated her and continued to rape her even after she was dead. When he was done, he took one of his ties and slowly strangled baby Geraldine until she died, a devilish smile on his pale face. In the evening, the unsuspecting husband returned from work and knocked on his neighbor's door to inquire about his wife. Christie, feigning sorrow and concern, told him that the abortion had gone wrong and led to Pearl's death. He convinced Timothy that her death was due to consuming too many abortion pills and that he had no hand in her death. When Timothy tearfully asked about his wife's body, Christie told him he had disposed of it by throwing it into the large sewer in front of the house to avoid legal trouble, as abortion was illegal at the time. As for baby Geraldine, he claimed he sent her to relatives to be cared for until things calmed down. Amazingly, Timothy believed all these lies. Not only that, but Christie also persuaded him to lay low for a while. So the next day Timothy traveled to his family home in Wales. However, his mother and sisters were not as gullible. They sensed something was wrong and urged him to return to London immediately to find out what happened to his daughter. Timothy returned and knocked on Christie's door again, demanding to see baby Geraldine. Christie told him that his relatives had taken her to the countryside. After much thought and fear, crying and hope, Timothy went to the police. He wanted to resolve the issue and get his child back, but he didn't go alone. He took his naivety with him. Instead of explaining exactly what had happened, he concocted a false story, claiming he accidentally caused his wife's death by giving her an overdose of abortion pills. The fool wanted to protect his kind neighbor Mr. Christie from legal trouble and took all the responsibility himself. When the police asked about his wife's body, he repeated Christie's story, saying he disposed of it in the sewer. The police opened the sewer and found nothing. No body. What happened then? Where are your wife and daughter? The police investigators shouted at Timothy, who was at a loss for answers as he truly did not know what had happened to them. When they pressed him with more questions, he finally told them the truth. His wife died during the abortion performed by John Christie, and his daughter was with Christie's relatives. They went with him to Christie's house and knocked on the door. The cunning old man answered, pretending to be shocked to see them. When asked about the missing wife, Christie's response hit Timothy like a thunderbolt. He completely denied performing any abortion or knowing the whereabouts of Beryl and Geraldine. Instead, he accused Timothy of killing them, citing their frequent fights, which all the neighbors could confirm. Naturally, the police believed John Christie, the respectable old man, the kind neighbor and former informant, and dismissed the young, foolish man known for his lies and constant arguments with his wife. Thus, Timothy Evans stood there, dumbfounded, watching the police put handcuffs on him. How astonishing! How had he suddenly turned from a victim into a murderer? For the police, there was a dilemma. There was no proof of a crime as there was no body, so they began a routine and quick search of the house. They found only a human femur bone used to support the garden fence. Surprisingly, the police did not question the origin of this bone or dig in the garden to look for more bones. If they had, they would have solved the entire case, as the remains of 2 human bodies were just a few feet away. 2 days later, the police returned with a specialized search team and began searching the house again. This time, their search did not take long. They quickly found the bodies of Beryl and her daughter wrapped in a carpet inside the laundry room in the backyard. A tie was still wrapped around the neck of the baby Geraldine. Timothy Evans was immediately charged with the murder of his wife and daughter. Under intimidation and torture, the investigators forced him to sign a confession admitting that he was the killer. The case caused an uproar in Britain, and the phrase, "brutal father kills wife and baby daughter," quickly made headlines across the country. The police were strangely determined to convict Timothy. There were several factors against him: his initial confession, financial troubles, alcohol abuse, frequent lying, and daily quarrels with Beryl. However, the police overlooked many flaws in the case against him. For instance, when the police first knocked on John Christie's door, he immediately accused Timothy of killing his wife and daughter. A significant mistake the police missed because Timothy had never mentioned his daughter's death and was unaware she had been killed. How did John Christie know unless he was the killer? The police also did not bother to investigate John Christie's dark past and his multiple imprisonments. They failed to investigate the origin of the unidentified human bone found in the garden during the initial search, or to dig and search the small neighboring garden. During his trial, Timothy repeatedly denied being the killer and insisted on accusing Christie. He claimed he confessed under police intimidation. Strangely, the main witness against Timothy was John Christie, who stood before the jurors with crocodile tears, narrating how Timothy was a bad and violent husband and how Christie always intervened to ease the poor wife's suffering. In 1950, Timothy was executed as previously mentioned. He was hanged and buried in an unmarked grave in the desolate prison yard, the typical burial for murderers. John Christie, however, returned home elated, having successfully exterminated an entire family: the mother, the daughter, and now the father. But his triumph was short-lived. The uproar from Timothy's trial turned the media's attention to Christie's past, revealing his shameful history of numerous offenses. Consequently, he was fired from his job, forced to close his bank account, nearly bankrupted, and dependent on government aid. To make matters worse, the second floor of his home, previously occupied by Timothy and his wife, was rented to black migrant workers from the Caribbean, which greatly displeased Christie, especially due to the shared bathroom. His conflicts with them escalated to the point of involving the police. Around this time, Ethel fell bedridden, her rheumatism worsening. These combined factors severely impacted Christie's mental and physical health, leading to constant complaints, increased paranoia, and significant weight loss. Nonetheless, he committed another crime in late 1952, this time murdering his wife Ethel. He strangled her in her sleep and hid her body under the living room floor. Unlike his other victims, this act was not sexual. He claimed he killed her out of mercy due to her unbearable pain. When neighbors inquired about her, he told them the doctor advised her to move to the countryside for her health. With Ethel gone, Christie had free rein to continue his crimes. In early 1953, his next victim was Rita Nelson, a 25-year-old pregnant woman whom he convinced he could help with an abortion. She was never seen again after he took her to his home. She died from strangulation like the others. To conceal her body, Christie created a cavity in the kitchen wall and hid her there, covering the space with a large wooden cabinet. Over the next 2 months, Christie murdered 2 more women: Kathleen Maloney, a 26-year-old prostitute whom he gassed, raped, and strangled, and Hectorina McLennan, also 26, whom he met at a nightclub with her boyfriend. He invited them both to his apartment, then lured Hectorina back alone and killed her, hiding her body behind the same cabinet. When her boyfriend came looking for her, Christie pretended concern and even accompanied him in the search. With 3 bodies behind the kitchen wall and 1 under the living room floor, the stench in Christie's home became unbearable, even for him. Complaints from neighbors grew louder, and even the strongest air fresheners couldn't mask the odor. Christie eventually abandoned the apartment, rented a room in a hotel, and deceived a young couple into renting his old apartment, taking 3 months' rent in advance. When the real landlord discovered this, He was furious, evicted the couple, and locked the apartment. Later, he rented the second floor to a new tenant who, finding the upstairs kitchen too small, asked to use the unoccupied downstairs kitchen. While cleaning it, the tenant moved the cabinet, revealing the 3 bodies wrapped in cloth. The police were called immediately. With the discovery of these bodies, the police thoroughly searched the house, quickly finding the other bodies, 1 under the floorboards and 2 in the garden. Christie's photos were disseminated everywhere, and he was arrested 10 days later, wandering the streets like a vagrant. He had only a small coin and a newspaper clipping about Timothy Evans in his pocket. Christie soon confessed to everything, causing a huge scandal as it was revealed that he was the true serial killer and Timothy Evans had been wrongly executed. Christie's trial was brief. His lawyers attempted an insanity defense, but the jury wasn't convinced and found him guilty, sentencing him to death. On the morning of June 22, 1953, John Christie was led to the execution chamber to face justice. The hangman was the same one who had executed Timothy. Unlike before, it wasn't Christie putting the noose around a neck. This time, the noose was around his own, sending him swiftly to his doom. An amusing incident occurred during Christie's execution. When the veteran hangman Albert Pierre Point placed the noose around his neck, Christie complained that the rope was rough and prickly. The hangman responded, "I assure you, sir, it won't bother you for long." According to official records, John Christie killed 8 people, 7 women and an infant, but there are serious doubts about the true number of his victims. Investigators found something puzzling in his apartment. Like many other serial killers, Christie kept trophies from his victims, specifically tufts of pubic hair. Laboratory analysis revealed that some of these tufts didn't match any of the known victims, indicating there were other unknown victims. Identifying them remains a mystery. After Christie's conviction and execution, efforts continued to clear Timothy's name. This officially happened in 1966 when his remains were moved from the prison yard to a cemetery, and in 2003, the government paid compensation to his sister. Most historians agree that the uproar and shock caused by the Timothy Evans case were major factors leading to the abolition of the death penalty in Britain in 1966.